Hi everyone, my name is Roni Lakin, and I'll be presenting Las dos mitades del mundo americano, Inventing American Futures in the Speculative 20th Century. I would like to extend a huge thank you to my advisor, Dr. Rodriguez from the Romance Studies Department. So I am a Spanish and English literature double major, and some of the guiding questions for this project emerged through my classes, and the three main ones that led to this specific project are up on the screen now. How did Latin American authors impact US literary production and consumption in the 20th century? Which genres were most prominent? And what can these literary patterns of influence tell us about US and Latin American perceptions of the Americas as a new world, as the genre I ended up with was speculative fiction. So here's my thesis, but before I read it, I want to break down just some of the terms. So focusing on the creation and influence of Argentine speculative fiction or fantastic literature preceding the Latin American publishing boom, I conceive of the speculative as a modality through which the Americas attempt to respond to the ongoing shocks of colonization and capitalist expansion. So what's speculative fiction? Speculative fiction is a broad generic term that we apply to utopian fiction, dystopian fiction, science fiction, and certain types of fantasy. It's a more recent critical category, and I'm applying it retroactively. Fantastic literature is a direct translation of lo fantástico, which is a specifically Latin American sort of version of the same sort of idea. The Latin American publishing boom was a spike in the popularity of Latin American literature in the 1960s and 1970s after a few authors really gained popularity. And the response to ongoing shocks of colonization and capitalist expansion is really looking at what kind of theories and methods I used, primarily dependency theory, economic theory, and decolonial theory. So I want to do a brief history of literary exchange between Latin America and the US because I think it provides a lot of really important and interesting context. So during the period of colonization, when Spain colonized Latin America and split it up into virreinatos, most of the literature people were consuming up until the Wars of Independence was being imported from Europe, primarily Spain and France. That's how I wrote there. Now, some people were also either moving to Spain and publishing there or sending their works to be published and maybe sent back to Latin America or consumed in Spain around the Wars of Independence, which would be 19th century. Those works were sometimes translated and sent to the US, or they were sent to the US in Spanish for the Spanish language market. A much smaller number of works were going directly from Latin America to the US, and this didn't even really start to pick up until the mid-20th century, late 20th century, and especially around the publishing boom that I mentioned earlier. And so for my project, I looked at four texts. A story by Jorge Luis Borges, originally published in 1940, called Tlon Ucbar Orbis Tertius. A story called La Raza Inextinguible by Silvino Campo, which was originally published in it was published in multiple different anthologies. So we had 1955-ish, a 1987 novel by Kurt Vonnegut called Bluebeard, and a short story by Ursula K. Le Guin called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, which was published in this anthology in 1973. I picked two from Argentinian authors, two from US authors, and I wanted to look at the interactions between these texts. And so Silvino Campo, who I mentioned, also had a really important literary figure as her older sister, who is Victoria Campo, who published this magazine called Sur, which its first edition came out in 1931. This is one of the first attempts to really define a broadly American literary movement as opposed to sort of this dependency on Europe. And one of the members of the editorial board of Sur was Borges, who I'm going to do a brief summary of the stories. I'm only going to be able to focus on Borges and Vonnegut because of time constraints. So basically, the story Tlon Ucbar Orbis Tertius outlines this fictional world that he finds in this encyclopedia. He eventually finds out that it was the product of a group of European philanthropists who are trying to create this utopian society, but it's actually fallen under the control of an American millionaire who promised to leave all of his resources, including enslaved persons, to the society if they would compile this encyclopedia about this utopian society. And a big part of this utopian society is his philosophy of subjective idealism, which basically says nothing exists except through perception, which allows them to negate space and time, cross the border between fictional and actual, and expand to fill any space. So this is actually a project that is similar to colonization in that it expands to fill the sort of blank space of the imagined utopia. Vonnegut is also interested in this idea of filling the space. This is just a quick reference that Vonnegut actually makes to the Borges short story when he talks about finding a fictional country in an encyclopedia. So we have the map of Tlön, which appears in the Borges story. The next example is this map of the Americas. In Bluebeard, Vonnegut's 1987 novel, the protagonist imagines, after seeing this map in a museum, that people were traveling across Europe with this map, promising riches on the virgin continent of the Americas, which was this sort of blank space. The protagonist is also a failed artist and art vendor. So his own paintings kind of flop. He paints all these wonderful paintings. They sell for thousands of dollars. But due to a chemical reaction, they actually all literally disappear off the canvas. So what he does is he uses these canvases as bills of exchange, picking up the term from Marx and Engels, that can be used to produce fictitious capital by bargaining with his artist friends and going to sell $10,000 worth of paintings when he doesn't even have $10 worth of paintings, as his wife puts it. So the use of these blank canvases is actually similar to the use of the map in that it projects value onto a space that has no inherent value, but holds the promise of the ability to invent. Now, you might be asking, why do I care? So these two stories are ultimately about the assignment or projection of value onto objects and futures. And they're also evidence of the power of transhemispheric encounters to inspire deeper thoughts into questions of national identity, the history of the Americas as a new world or blank space, and the fate of the continent through the genre of speculative fiction. Instead of adhering to historic assumptions of American literary traditions as entirely dependent on Europe, or as dependent on the global North more generally as we get further into the history and look at Latin America and the US, we might think about US Latin American literary traditions as interdependent, as dealing with these shared questions of what does it mean to occupy a new world. And we as readers cannot achieve a broad enough view on the Americas without exploring works from both hemispheres and reading through the encounters between them. To use the words of Waldo Frank, an American author and big proponent of Latin American literature, American readers occupy los dos lados del mundo americano, the two halves of the American world, but it's still one world, and the lines that divide it are the products of speculators. Thank you. Question?
Can I ask why you picked Argentinian authors specifically in terms of the Spanish language novels that you were reading? Because there's obviously a lot of options out there.
So Argentina was notable because it's a pretty big publishing hub. This magazine that I mentioned, Sur, which was kind of like the center for South American writing, is coming out of Argentina. Buenos Aires was the first one of the first cities to have these really big publishing houses, which weren't as common in Latin America. So that's the main reason I picked it. Also, the idea of lo fantástico, like the genre, comes out of the group of specifically Borges Ocampo and Bioy Casares, who put together this anthology that you see up on the screen in 1940. So that's the main reason.
Hi, awesome presentation. I had a quick question about when you mentioned sort of like the literature going from like Latin America to the United States. If you can just expand a little more on that, because I think that that's really interesting because as you said, yeah.
That's a really interesting story. So Waldo Frank, who I mentioned, moved to and traveled around Latin America, who was a huge proponent of translating it and bringing it to the US, kind of in like a mildly weird and racist way where he's like, they're more connected to the earth. But then we had publishers like Alfred Knopf, who, if people know Knopf Publishing, it's a big publishing company, who in the 1940s started to travel around the world and was also a huge proponent of translating works and bringing them to the US. And we started to see, with the Latin American boom that I mentioned in the 60s and 70s, it gained a lot more popularity in the US. This is where we get magical realism. If you know anything about Latin American literature, you've probably heard about magical realism, if it's like the one thing you know. Yeah.